Hello, my name is Alex, and today I'll be presenting on Aeromedical Factors. Fair warning, I'm overcoming some sort of cold or flu, I'm not entirely sure, so I'll have a little bit of cough maybe here or there, so I hope that doesn't bother you too much. But anyways, getting into this, Aeromedical Factors, there are plenty of elements that we will cover today, ranging from I am safe checklist that we'll talk about later, or elements of hypoxia, classes of medicals, all of those sorts of things. And in these discussions, I'm hoping that my students will be able to kind of correlate the relationship between physical health and how it affects our flying. Also, regulatory elements of classes of medicals, and kind of the not too in depth, but definitely in more depth than usual, in terms of like the physiological and the biological effects and how they impact maybe our judgment, our senses, how sometimes our body can be lying to us effectively, and how we can mitigate those problems. So first off, we'll start with medicals, and medicals specifically, they are assigned by an AME, or an aviation medical examiner, right? And that is someone who is not just a physician, but someone who specifically deals with medicals and giving medicals to aviators and pilots. These are individuals who are trained specifically to look for things specifically for aviators. There's a whole list of medicines that can be flown without, that AMEs are very, very familiar with, and as pilots we have access to those. If we go to the FAA, there's a medications tab on their website that will show you all the medications you cannot fly with, and medications that would detract from your medical. And so there are different levels of medicals. There's first, second, and third class. And and for a student, either commercial or private, it really, well, for the commercial, it would matter in terms of how they exercise their commercial privileges, but in terms of in this collegiate program, it produced specifically what we need to have in order to operate will differ from an actual commercial pilot and how they operate. So the different types of medicals are, like we said before, first, second, and third class. So we'll write those down. First class, second class, and third class. We'll separate those. And so for first class medicals, those are medicals for individuals who operate usually for a Part 121 operation or an airline. This is what's typically referred to in the Part 121 world, or to act as PIC, pilot in command, and have those privileges for those operators. So typically for ATP pilots, PIC usually, and those medicals, it's important for us to know, are good for 12 calendar months if you are under the age of 40, right? 12 months if you're less than 40. 40, less than 40. And then if you're over the age of 40, you can exercise these first class privileges for 6 months. So 6 months. 6 months if you're over 40. Now, specifically for this medical, you can operate under first class so like we said, 12 months under the age of 40, 6 months. Every 6 months you'll need to renew it over the age of 40. which means that hypothetically, if you're 39 years old and 364 days, um, you could get a first-class medical privilege that would last you the entirety of the 12 months. It is all dependent on when you receive this medical certification. So if you're lucky enough to get your medical right before you turn the age of 40, you can operate and use those privileges for 12 months. But every medical you get beyond that, you will have to operate, and you'll have to get that medical every 6 calendar months is also a distinction. These are all calendar months, right? So, so if you were to get a medical, let's say on like August 5th of 2020, and you're under the age of 40, right? You were able to exercise those privileges until the end of August of the next year, right? So it's not 12. It's not 12 months. It's 12 calendar months, and that's an important distinction when getting your medicals. Also, now going to second class, and we'll get to kind of how these medical deteriorates after we define them. For our second class privileges, these are for, and this is probably more relevant for a commercial applicant, a 243 or 248, because this is, or even a 253, I guess, since they haven't received a certificate yet at that point. But these applicants are starting, and they need to understand when or what they need to operate for commercial privileges, right? So typically second-class medicals are for those who are trying to use their commercial privileges and their commercial certification. And for those second-class medicals, those are issued, so again, commercial applicants, or commercial pilots, I should say, no longer applicants once they have the certification. For commercial pilots, and that allows them it allows them to fly for compensation or higher. So in order to fly for compensation or higher, you have to have this second class medical, which is issued every 12 calendar months. It's good for 12 calendar months, right? Calendar months, remember, it's calendar months. And that's important to know, again, because we cannot fly for compensation or higher if we do not have one of these two medicals. This first class medical can operate as it can exercise the privileges of a second class medical. So it's almost all encompassing. Whatever first class covers, it covers second and third, right? And second class can cover third as well. And now going to third class medical. So for this is probably a lot more relevant. I mean, for all of us in collegiate aviation, for sure, but definitely for our student pilots and our pilots who just want to exercise recreational privileges. Pilots who aren't necessarily trying to fly for hire, they only need this third class medical. And this third class medical is good for 60 calendar months if you're under the age of 40. 60 calendar months, right? And it's good for 24 calendar months if you're over the age of 40. 24 calendar months. Remember, this is under the age of 40, and then over the age of 40. Right? And the same applies to what we discussed in the first class medical. If you receive this third class medical certification the day before your 40th birthday, you can still operate for 60 calendar months, right? And something that's also important to understand about these medicals is that for the first class medical, again, we talked about how it covers the privileges of second and third class as well. So let's say, like for me, for example, I could probably actually pull up an example of my medical. If you look at your medical certification, this is mine right here. I won't, for legal reasons, I won't necessarily show everything. Well, why not? It says that in the date of my examination was May 10th of 2019, right? So in that scenario, I got a first class medical. I wanted to make sure that if I really wanted to do this pilot thing for a career, that I would physically be able to do so, right? The last thing you want to do is get a third-class medical, go through all of collegiate flying, pay all this money, go into all this debt in some cases, just to realize that, I'm not eligible for a first-class medical, so I can't realize my dream of flying for a Part 141 operation, right? In order to have an ATP, in order to act in an ATP operation, you have to have that first-class medical. But with that being said, I got my first-class medical to make sure that I could meet those goals, right? Or had the ability to do so. But in getting the first-class medical, I got that back in 2019, so it's been a couple of years at this point. Would, and this is a question I would ask a student after explaining this, would my first-class medical still be eligible? Would I be able to exercise first-class medical activities, right, or privileges? And at this point, I would hope that my student would say, no, of course not. It's been a lot longer than 12 calendar months. Even though you're under the age of 40, it's still been way longer than 12 calendar months, and they'd be correct. But an important distinction to understand about medicals is that I still have a first-class medical, right? That first-class medical is still there. I cannot use the privileges of a first-class medical, but if you look at this diagram, right, first-class medical also operates. You can exercise the privileges of a second-class medical and a third-class medical, right? So here, would I be able to exercise second-class privileges? The answer I would hope my student would give is also no. It has been longer than 12 calendar months. So you can't use your first-class medical, but you also can't use your commercial private privileges of the second-class medical because it has still been longer than 12 calendar months, right? So then what can I exercise? It has been a couple of years since I've gotten a medical, almost 3 to the day to be exact. What can I use? Well, I'm still under the age of 40, right? So I should still be able to operate with my third-class medical privileges. So this allows me to be either a student pilot, which I'm already a certified licensed pilot, so no longer a student pilot, but it also would allow me to operate with CFI privileges, right? It would let me operate as recreational privileges, all sorts of things. I would be able to operate because I still, and this is an important key to understand, I still have a first-class medical. I'm just operating under third-class privileges, right? So that is something that is very, very important in terms of medical certifications and medical privileges and how that works and what comes with that. And this is something that we will need to know as pilots. This is something we should know beyond just ACS standards, beyond just the check ride. Yes, you might be asked this on a check ride, but it is important to understand because if I were to operate, if you were to get hired one day at an airline and they caught you in your medical, if they did a ramp check or something and the FAA wanted to say, okay, can I see your medical certificate? And you're at your job, right? And it has been 15 calendar months since you got a first-class medical, and you wouldn't be able to exercise those privileges of flying, and you could get fired, you could get in a lot of trouble if you're exercising first-class privileges while you're not eligible to exercise those first-class privileges. And same thing, understanding, oh, shoot, I got a first-class medical. I think it's something as in our collegiate aviation world, it's very, very helpful to realize is, man, I can only exercise first-class privileges. Of course not. You can. It's good to know, like for me, when I went to get my first-class medical, that I will be good in the program that I'm currently in for 60 calendar months, right? So those are very, very important elements that we need to understand with medicals and what allows us to be able to fly, right? Legally speaking, we need to have one of these medicals, right? All right. So that covers our medicals, right? And now we will need to be talking about hypoxia. And hypoxia, what it really means is, in general, and there's many different types of hypoxia, but it's either reduced oxygen in your system or not enough oxygen for whatever reason. And there there are a lot of different forms of hypoxia that we will talk about for aeromedical factors, right? So again, it's either reduced oxygen or not enough oxygen in the system. It is susceptible usually as we gain altitude, right? So what happens when we gain altitude in terms of like air content? What is so important about air content as we go up in altitude? As we gain altitude, what happens to the content of the air that we are maneuvering in and we are operating in, right? And at this point, I would hope that a private applicant might know this, depending on their education level. A commercial applicant should definitely know this, but as we go up in altitude, right, the amount of air is significantly less. The content of the air is the same. We'll still have, I don't know the numbers, maybe it's 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other gases, right? We know that content remains the same, but just the sheer amount of air will decrease. And with that, each of the parts of the air, the nitrogen, the oxygen, and the other gases will also decrease, right? So we'll still have 21% oxygen air content, right? But that 21% will be representing a lot less because the overall content of the air is less, right? So as we go up in altitude, usually we're susceptible to hypoxia at 10,000 feet MSL during the day. That is the general rule of thumb. So I won't even write it down. 10,000 feet during the day. It's just a good rule of thumb to live by. So definitely can experience some of those effects at lower altitudes, but we definitely want to understand that as we go up, we will be experiencing some deficiencies. So we'll start with hypoxia, right? Hypoxia. So what hypoxia is a result of insufficient oxygen available to the lungs. So for whatever reason, the obvious ways that we can see are we have a clogged airway. If you're choking on something, you're not going to be able to get that oxygen into your bloodstream, into your body, available to your lungs. So it's the availability of the oxygen to the lungs, right? So if we can't get oxygen to the lungs, then we can't provide it to the rest of our body. We can't provide it to our cells and our muscles and our tissues and everything that oxygen facilitates in our body. We won't be able to do. Those are the obvious ways is, again, blocked airway or like non-aviation related. If you're holding your breath underwater, you're drowning, all those things are definitely a part of hypoxia. But in aviation specifically, the reduction of pressure in the air around us can lead to insufficient oxygen being able to get to your lungs, right? So as we talked about earlier, when we travel up in the air, the rule of thumb being about 10,000 MSLs, when we can feel the lack of oxygen in the air, there's not going to be enough pressure to keep that oxygen available to your lungs, right? So the regulations in terms of hypoxia and things we need to look out for is it is regulatory, is made regulatory by the FAA that at 12,500 feet, right, at 12,500 feet, it is required that if we are up there for over 30 minutes, that we have supplemental oxygen for pilots, right? We need O2 for pilots at 12,000 feet or more. 12,000 feet or more. Supplemental oxygen, so O2 for pilots, right? And that makes sense because, remember, as we lose oxygen available to our lungs, the effects can include, reaction time reduces, we were fatigued, we're usually not able to cognitively function as we normally do due to the not having enough oxygen available to our system. And then as we go up in altitude, right, as we go up in altitude to 14,000 feet, there is no time limit, right? Once you get there, it's not like the 12,500. We're at 30 minutes. We have to have supplemental oxygen available to pilots. Once we're at 14,000 feet, all of the crew, all of the necessary crew to the flight have to have oxygen available to their disposal, to their personal use. They have to have oxygen at 14,000 feet. So all crew at 14,000 feet, all crew must have O2. Right, that makes sense because, again, remember, the effects of hypoxic hypoxia are more prevalent as we gain altitude, right? So from 12,500 feet for 30 minutes, right, we're going to feel those effects, but as we go higher up in altitude, those effects will be pronounced even more, right? And then the last regulation or regulatory requirement for hypoxic hypoxia, right? Remember, not having enough oxygen available to the lungs. The FAA has taken this into account, and they've made a regulation that at 15,000 feet, everyone must have oxygen. Everyone, right? Everyone must have O2. So that means, like, when you board a plane, and they say, okay, like, here's where the oxygen mask will be if we drop below a certain pressure. Like, you have to have that oxygen available to you at all times. And during normal phases of flight, right, that's pressurized, is maintained in the cabin. But in an event where we were to lose that pressurization, we were to lose that oxygen supply, we have to have that supplemental oxygen in the form of the oxygen masks that drops out for us, right? So the next form of hypoxia we have is hypemic hypoxia. So we have hypoxic, we have hypemic, hypoxia. And what hypemic hypoxia is when the blood is not able to transport a sufficient amount of oxygen to the cells in the body, right? So usually this can be a result of losing blood in extreme cases. If you have a cut and you're bleeding out, obviously the blood is not going to be able to transport oxygen to your cells and to your muscles that are required to sustain your body, because the blood is traveling out of the body. It's taking that oxygen with it, right? And it's obviously not going to be able to get where it's going if it's bleeding out, right? And that is something that is actually a lot more pronounced at altitude, right? So when we bleed on the ground, obviously we want to not bleed. We want to keep all our blood in our body. That is ideal. That's what it's designed to do, is be inside of your body. But that is something that is a lot less of an issue on the ground. As we get in the air, we need more and more of that oxygen because there's less of that oxygen in the air to transport, that we need all of the transportation of oxygen that we can get to make it readily available to our body. So you can pass out. You can pass out on the ground, obviously, for bleeding enough, but in the air, even a lot less of blood can cause you to pass out in the air. It can cause you to lose consciousness. Pass out, I guess, is the same thing. It can cause you to cognitively not function as well. Your reaction time can be less because you don't have the oxygen that is needed for your body. And also not enough blood volume. If your blood's not thick enough and if it doesn't have the volume necessary to carry the amount of oxygen that you need to your body, that can be a problem as well. So people, like, usually on blood thinners and stuff like that, they can be more susceptible to hypemic hypoxia, right? And then blood donation. Blood donation is another big one. I remember, quick story time, in my flight training, I am scared of needles, so nothing ended up happening. But I had a time where I contemplated going to give blood because all of my friends are doing it. It was like an easy way to give money, at least easy way to get money, easy way to help people, all sorts of things. Long story short, I chickened out, but one of the reasons why I chickened out, and one of the reasons why I didn't want to do it is because I was worried about this hypemic hypoxia. I didn't want to give blood, then go fly on a solo flight the next day and crash and burn and kill myself. So I had friends who gave blood and flew, but for me personally, I just found it safe, right, to not do that. And those are decisions you'll have to make as a pilot. You'll have to make decisions of, okay, how will this impact my safety? How will this impact my own safety as well as the safety of my passengers or other people that I'm flying with, right? So blood donation, again, you're not going to have as much blood in your system, right, if you give it away, right? Similar to bleeding, right? If blood that's not in your body is blood that you can't use, right? And blood that you can't use can't transport oxygen to different systems in your body, right? Certain blood diseases such as anemia also have an impact on this. The hemoglobin in the blood can also help with transportation of oxygen if you're chemically unable to bind oxygen to your blood cells with the hemoglobin and how it acts as that mediator between your blood cells and the oxygen, right? If you don't have that hemoglobin to bind the oxygen with your blood, then it doesn't matter, right? If you have blood but oxygen can't bind to it, then it obviously can't transport it throughout the body, right? And while this is not necessarily as big of a deal on the ground, once again, in air, all of these effects are pronounced even more, right? And then for our next form of hypoxia, we have stagnant hypoxia, right? I'm going to come over here. Stagnant hypoxia, right? Stagnant hypoxia. Hypoxia. And this form of hypoxia, and this form of hypoxia is important to realize because, again, this is blood as the word implies, right? What does stagnant mean, just in the English language? And for a student, I don't know what their relationship is with the English language, but I would hope that they could maybe piece together that stagnant hypoxia is stagnant, right? Sitting, not moving, right? Not doing anything. Hypoxia, right? And hypoxia having to do with oxygen in our blood and how it is transported throughout our body. That they could maybe even piece together, oh, stagnant hypoxia must be blood can't transport, or just sitting and can't transport oxygen throughout the body, right? So for stagnant hypoxia, it is blood that can't be transported, right? So is blood cannot transport O2. It's sitting. Transport O2 for whatever reason, right? Sitting. Oh, no, that's not how you're supposed to say. Sitting, right? Not moving, right? / not moving, right? And if you can't move your blood, then you're not going to be able to transport that oxygen throughout your body, right? And so one instance where you can have stagnant hypoxia is where you're experiencing G-forces, right? And this is relevant to general aviation, but even more so relevant to acrobatics or military flying. I know my dad actually flew for the Air Force, and in those situations, he did pilot training for fighter pilots, and he would have to wear special suits, right, known as G suits, which I'll talk about in a minute. But they would use excessive amounts of G forces would be imposed on their body, right? So your blood would tend to, if you didn't have a G suit, especially, tend to sit, right? Like if you're pulling G forces, the blood would rush out of your brain, which would make you, if you sustain enough G forces, and if your body especially is not used to G forces and used to sustaining them, then you can black out, right? You can pass out. You can see so many videos that of just pilots passing out due to excessive G-forces, and you see kind of the weight rush from their face, right? And they can get pale and all sorts of things. They can vomit. Those are all parts of stagnant hypoxia, but that is because your body doesn't have the pressure to push that blood throughout your system when 8 times or 6 times the force of gravity are making that blood sit in one spot, right? So, in general aviation, we typically will not sit at 6 or 8 Gs, right? 6 or 8 times the force of gravity. But it is one of the ways in which we can experience it. Another way we can experience stagnant hypoxia is when the blood in the heart just isn't pumping strong enough, right? If people who have heart problems or constricted artery or have experienced shock, or all those things are ways that can contribute to stagnant hypoxia and contribute to the blood not being able to flow throughout the body. And what G suits do, going back to the example of G forces, right? For those fighter pilots, you always see them with their helmets and their big old suits. That will keep the blood, it will help them constrict it and sustain more G-forces and counteract the force of gravity, drawing the blood from the system to sit in a certain spot, right? So that's one way that we experience stagnant hypoxia. Another way we can experience stagnant hypoxia is in cold temperatures. Because what it comes down to is your body, what it will do in situations where it's cold, right? It will always revert back to protecting itself, right? So what's most important in your body? Your fingers or your heart, right? So when it gets cold, your body, and it gets cold enough, excessively cold, your body will be like, all right, I'm going to protect my organs. The rest of your limbs and everything else, you're on your own, right? Like, I need to do what I can to preserve myself. It's self-preservation in its simplest form, right? So when it's cold, that can lead to your fingers might look blue or white or discolored. You'll lose coordination because you'll lose reaction time because there's not that blood transporting that oxygen to your limbs, right, and to things outside of your core. So that is another result or way that we can experience stagnant hypoxia. And another form of hypoxia that's important, and I'm going to clear up, I'm going to come over here, is hystoxic hypoxia, right? Hystoxic hypoxia. And what hystoxic hypoxia is the inability of the cells to effectively use oxygen, right? So for whatever reason, this can usually happen because of alcohol, right? Like alcohol is effectively a poison to the body, right? As fun as some people might see it, this is the exact reason why we have rules about when we can drink as pilots, how much we can drink, like in terms of like blood alcohol content, right? Like obviously the regulatory rules are you can't have a greater than 0.04 blood alcohol content, right, in your body and fly, right? That's against the rules. Like if you're caught doing that, you will lose your licenses. You will lose everything as a pilot, right? We don't fly with that, but that is for our own safety. It's because it's not because the FAA doesn't like us to have a good time, right? If you're into drinking, it is to protect us from hystoxic hypoxia, right? Because what happens is when you drink alcohol, right, it interacts with your blood, where your blood simply is not able to receive this oxygen. It's not able to effectively use it, right? Right, histo, right, in its simplest term, histo refers to tissues or cells, right, like the histosystem, right, in our body, tissues and cells, and toxic means hypoxia. So drugs, narcotic drugs, are another way, something that can interact with our blood in a way that would not allow it to effectively use this oxygen, right? And while we can have these effects on the ground, just like when we talked about hypoxia and all the other forms of hypoxia, it is pronounced in the air, right? When we drink, it is almost as if we're adding another, I don't remember, 1 ounce of alcohol, I believe. I think the measurement is for every 1 ounce of alcohol, it's like adding 2,000 feet of physiological altitude, right? So that is something that you need to keep into account if you choose to consume alcohol, right? I think general rule of thumb for me personally, I don't drink when I fly ever anywhere near to it. I don't really drink at all. Obviously, don't drink if you're underage. But that is something that you need to keep in mind is how is this going to affect my body in alcohol or narcotic drugs, which illegal to begin with, shouldn't be using them at all. But if you choose to do so, you definitely should not fly. You definitely should not fly for the very same reason as alcohol, is it will affect your blood's ability, right, to effectively use oxygen, and that is something that we do not want to experience as pilots. And for hypoxia in general, as a rule, it can cause all sorts of things. Like we've even mentioned a few of them. Cyanosis is one of the things we talk about, which is where blood is not able to transport or effectively transport or use oxygen in your tissues and in your extremities, specifically of your fingers. And an indication of that of cyanosis is blue fingernails and lips, right? Headaches are another big one. Like effectively, whenever your body is stressed or has something wrong with it, you can always guarantee headache is a symptom, right? So you'll feel a headache. You'll have definitely a decreased reaction time, right? If your cells and if your muscles and your tissues, right, don't have the oxygen necessary to function, they're not going to function well, right? The oxygen is the fuel for tissues, right? Without fuel, you can't run, and without proper fueling, you're not going to be able to run properly, right? So you're going to have decreased reaction time. So something that could take you seconds to do when you're on your right mind will take a lot longer if you are experiencing any type of hypoxia, right? You're also going to have impaired judgment, right? When you're fatigued, right? When your body doesn't have the rest, or in this case, the oxygen that it needs, it's not going to have enough energy for you to effectively use your judgment. Like when you're fatigued, when you wake up in the morning, and before you've had your coffee, if you guys drink coffee, do you operate the same as when you're well rested, right? If you come off a night where you slept 2 hours or you slept 4 hours or whatever, are you going to be as prepared physically as you would be if you're properly rested, right? If you have a good night's rest, right? Same thing with hypoxia. If your body doesn't have the oxygen necessary to function at prime levels, you're not going to be able to think properly, right? You're going to have a sense of euphoria. You're going to have sense. There's a lot of people who, when they experience hypoxia, they don't even know they're experiencing hypoxia, right? There are videos that I've seen, which I could potentially show a student in the future and in future discussions about hypoxia, where at the University of North Dakota, they have a room where they actually simulate, right, hypoxia. And a lot of the time, people kind of get all loosey-goosey, right? And they don't understand what is happening to them. They have a sense of euphoria of like, oh, like I feel great, right? When in reality, they have no idea that they're experiencing hypoxia. And the last one is visual impairment. Not the last one, the last of many, right? There's so many things that hypoxia can affect: drowsiness, lightheaded, dizzy, numb, tingling in your fingers and toes, which kind of goes along with numbness. But visual impairment is another important one because specifically when we're flying through like IMC conditions or anything of that sort, we need our eyes to be able to distinguish and to be able to interpret the information necessary for us to fly, right? And so we do not want to lose our eyes. We do not want to lose visual impairment. So that is why we need to be very, very cognizant of the scenarios where we might have higher risk of experiencing hypoxia because by the time that we experience it, it might be too late. We might not even recognize it, right? So another thing that's important with all of these, with hypoxia and just experiencing lack of oxygen in our tissues for whatever reason, whether it be stagnant, hystoxic, hypemic, all of those things, it's important to realize that this does have real effects. And something that I have recently taken the Hawker ground course at Purdue, 354, and in it we're able to really see how these effects are pronounced because, right, jets operate at higher altitudes, right? They can operate anywhere between 30 and 40,000 feet, right? With the highest flight level, or the flight level that's highest that usually the Hawker can operate at, is 41,000 feet, flight level 410. That's really, really high. It's a lot higher than 5,500 feet on a cross country in our Purdue flight courses, right? And because of that, right, as we go up in altitude, the effects of hypoxia are a lot more pronounced, right, as we get higher and higher in altitude. And it's not even just like a gradual increase, right? The effects are exponential as we go up in altitude. And in my Hawker course, I was able to see, they had this chart where it was like, I think if you're 20,000 feet or below, I believe you could have 30 minutes of useful consciousness at this altitude, right? 30 minutes. You could think, you could get on the ground, you'd have enough time to do stuff. But if you get to flight level 410 or higher, you might have 5 to 15 seconds, right? Which is why when you board an aircraft, they always say, put your mask on before you help others around you, right? And I know for those of us who have flown a lot, right, we might just sit through the safety brief and be like, okay, like this is just required by the FAA. They're just saying this because they have to, like yada, yada, yada. But if you actually listen, right, they're going to tell you, put your mask on first, then help others. Because your time of useful consciousness at very, very high altitudes is not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be the same. You're going to have to react fast. And if someone passes out, you can always still supply them with oxygen, and they'll be okay. But you always want to make sure to keep yourself safe so that you can help others. You need to put that mask on first. That is not just a silly rule by the FAA that has to do with useful consciousness, right? Hyperventilation, that's also another huge thing, huge problem in aviation, right? For whatever reason, people's bodies respond to higher flight levels where their body doesn't think they're getting enough oxygen, right? So what the body does is it overreacts and it freaks out and it hyperventilates, right? You breathe really, really fast. Hyperventilation is when you're breathing too fast, right? So when that happens, people breathe really, really fast, but what they do is the chemical imbalance of the air inside of their body varies way too much, right? You're exhaling so much carbon dioxide when you're bringing in all this oxygen that your oxygen levels in your body are no longer stable, right? So for hyperventilation, that can cause people to pass out. That can cause headaches, decreased judgment, euphoria, visual impairment, drowsiness, all the things that we experience with hypoxia, we can also experience with hyperventilation. So when someone is experiencing hyperventilation, have you, as a student, have you ever heard, because hyperventilation is not something that is necessarily unique to aviation, right? We can see it all around, on the ground as well, right? And so I would interact with my student in this scenario, and I would ask them, in hyperventilation, have you ever heard of any ways that you can overcome hyperventilation? And some people might not know, that's completely okay, but I remember even growing up, like you watch movies, silly movies, like I remember, it's a little off topic, but I believe it was Chicken Little, right? And there's a pig in the movie, right? And he's breathing into this paper bag, right? The reason for that is that when you exhale, right, you're exhaling that carbon dioxide, right? And when you exhale carbon dioxide, right, in hyperventilation, you want to balance the air that's entering your lungs, right? And if you're exhaling too much carbon dioxide, that will create that imbalance. So what you do is you breathe into that paper bag, which you then breathe that carbon, you exhale that carbon dioxide into the bag, which then the bag traps that air, and you re-inhale that carbon dioxide, right? And it'll keep you more balanced. It will help you control your breathing. Another thing you can do is you can either sing or speak out loud. That can help people control their breathing and properly react to their body's improper response, right? And those are all the things that you can do when you experience hyperventilation, right? And then there's also when you gain up, if you've ever flown in a large category aircraft, right, and you're at flight level, 360 or whatever you're at some high altitude, as you're climbing, right, there's those pressure differentials in the air, in the environment around you, in the air as you climb up, right, you're going to have less oxygen, less overall air, right, and so less pressure at higher altitudes, and you might feel a popping in your ears, right, you might feel a tension on your ears, right, and that's all a result of these cavities in your ear that have not equalized to the pressure around you yet, right? And this is pronounced significantly when the sinuses and the openings in your throat and the outer ear and all these tubes that equalize the pressure in your body, right, are clogged, right? If you're sick, right? Like I've been overcoming sickness recently. If your sinuses are clogged, right, then that body will, then your body will trap that pressure that it had when it was on the ground in your system, which can cause extreme, excruciating pain when you get up to altitude. So things that you can do is, one, not fly. If it's bad enough where it's going to cause you enough pain where it's not worth you flying, don't fly, right? Techniques that people can use when it's either minor or even when there's nothing wrong with them and you're still experiencing that pressure differential in your body adjusting to it. I've seen people chew gum, right? And that will cause this opening in these cavities in your middle ear and in your throat to open up, right? When you're chewing, the act of chewing can cause these things to open up. Yawning is a huge one. Yawning is something that can expand that tube in your throat and allow it to equalize those pressures, right? And those are a few of the things that we can do. Sinus problems, again, huge with pain and flying and our body not being able to equalize those pressures. Another thing that we can experience in aviation is spatial disorientation, which, if you think it through, right, is being disoriented in your surroundings, right? And being disoriented and not understanding or not firmly having a grasp on your position in the aircraft, in the position of the aircraft in space, right? And like how it's moving and how it's orientating itself and all of these things is important for flight, right? And then there's a specific system called the vestibular system, right? In your ear. And there's this fluid in this vestibular system, right? That helps your body balance, right? And helps your body understand where it is. And when you're standing on the ground, not moving drastically, not putting your body in a position where it's sustaining a certain type of motion, these little cilia or these little hairs in your ears will move one way, right, or the other. And then that interpretation and the movement of those hairs based on this fluid that moves along these hairs, right? That it moves along these hairs in your vestibular system, right? It'll allow you to kind of like, okay, like if I move this way really quick, okay, my body orients itself around that motion that is felt by your inner ear, right? So if you close your eyes and you move, right, you can kind of understand where you are in space because your body kind of adapts to those changes, right? And it's like, okay, whoa, like this fluid's moving this direction, moving these hairs with it, right? So that's how we know we are moving in space, right? Well, the problem with this comes in aviation, where if we sustain a motion, right, if we sustain a steep turn, or if we sustain something and we're completely and we take, for whatever reason, we're in IMC conditions maybe where we can't see outside, or in training, right, we'll have maneuvers where an instructor will go, okay, put your head down, close your eyes, to simulate loss of visual systems for whatever reason, right? And then if you've ever sat through this, or I as an instructor should at this point, either in the next lesson or in the lesson prior, show you what that is like before describing this. But you'll put your head down, you close your eyes, they'll do all sorts of motions, right? And your body, what it does is it orients itself to, okay, like for example, in the steep turn analogy, we sustain a steep turn, right? And you don't know what's going on. Your body will be like, okay, like we're moving, right? And the plane will go from straight and level. Okay, you feel the straight and level. There's no motion going on in these hairs inside your inner ear. But then once you're in the airplane, right, and you got your wheels and you're doing a steep turn, right? These hairs will be like, whoa, he's entering a left steep, left bank, right? And your body will be like, okay, whoa, like we're sitting here. But then you sit there for long enough, I think even as little as 20 seconds, I believe, your body, all the food will kind of stay there. And your body will be like, okay, like this is the new normal, right? This must be straight and level. This must be where we're at, right? And then in a scenario like that, right, you look up and you're like, whoa, actually, based on my visual system, I know that I'm not straight and level right now, right? And another situation is if you sustain that for 20 seconds or longer, right, and your body accustoms itself to like, okay, this is normal, right, and then you go back to straight and level, then the hairs in your ear and the food will go the other direction. And you'll be straight and level, right? You'll be straight and level, right? But you'll go from a steep turn to straight and level, and your hairs will move along with it and be like, whoa, 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 we're going to the right now, right? And that's why it's very, very important to rely on your instruments, right? Because your body can come into situations where it doesn't really understand where it is in space, right? So that's why in instrument training, you're always reliant on your instruments, because what happens when you go through a patch of clouds and you become disoriented very, very easily into a situation that you're not necessarily familiar with, right? Then you need to rely on your visual system, because the instruments should be reliable, right? Your instruments will keep you informed, your body will lie. Effectively, that's what that comes down to. So flight into IMC is where this is a pronounced element, something that we need to be really aware of, right? And then with these, there's all sorts of different illusions that we can have. We can first have the leans, which the leans is caused by a sudden return to level flight, as we talked about right here, after a prolonged period where the pilot didn't know that we were in a configuration that was not straight and level flight, right? So this can be avoided by avoiding by using abrupt changes, right? So if we're leveling off, maybe we can roll out a lot slower. Maybe we can do whatever it takes for our body and the hairs in our head to not sense this is an abrupt change and lie to us. Another illusion is the Coriolis illusion, which takes place when a turn in the fluid in the ear can move at the same speed, right? So it's the situation where we're in that steep turn, right? And we sustain that steep turn, and our body just kind of like, okay, like this is it, right? This is normal, right? It adjusts, right? Your body adjusts to the new normal, right? And we can experience this by even moving our heads, right? Can cause a change in this illusion, right? It's not just the movement of the aircraft, but the movement of our head inside of the aircraft, right? It can cause us to have reactions that are out of the norm, right? So we want to move excessive head movements in the aircraft, right? So for the leans, we want to avoid abrupt changes. For the Coriolis illusion, right, we want to avoid abrupt changes of our own head within the aircraft. in a graveyard spiral, similar to the leans, but as soon as the pilot turns in the opposite direction, right, we will feel like we're descending potentially, right? And in a descent, what our reaction is as pilots is, okay, like I'm going to pull the nose back, right? And if we pull the nose back, we can induce a stall. We can put ourselves in a situation where, especially if we're not in that dangerous situation, we're actually not descending. If we pull back, we can stall ourselves and put us into a situation or a spin or all sorts of different illusion or all sorts of different situations that we do not want to be in, right? Or a somatographic illusion is where we have rapid acceleration that stimulates these movements by our head moving backwards. And when our head moves backwards, we and this acceleration happens, we can tend to think that we are in a nose high attitude, and we can push our stick or our yoke forward, thinking that we're in a nose high position, when in reality that acceleration didn't change our pitch attitude, it just changed our speed, right? Like when you're in a car, and if you've ever stepped on the gas, right, and you get this sensation of you sinking back into your seat, right? It's the same with this illusion, where that acceleration causes your body to react with whoa. Like, remember, like if you're accelerating, you sink back into your seat, you think that you're pointing your nose up, when in reality, you're just accelerating, right? So that can cause our body to naturally respond by putting us in a low attitude, which is something you want to avoid, because obviously if we're at low altitudes, that can be especially dangerous. And there's all sorts of visual illusions as well. There's the false horizon, right? Where you have maybe obscured clouds that are in a situation that is not normal, or at night you can have autokinesis, right, which is when you're in the dark and there's lights on the ground. You can confuse those with stars in the sky, right, and then you can have this false horizon, false sense of what is up and what is down, right? And so with those things, we want to try, for the autokinesis, for the lights on the ground, we want to try to avoid looking at one light for a very, very long time. That's why at night, scans are so important, where we're having every couple of seconds, we're going a certain amount of degrees, checking our surroundings and not focusing on one thing for a prolonged period of time. And with false horizons, with the clouds and other obstructions to the horizon, we want to focus on our instruments. When in doubt, trust your instruments, don't trust your body. The instruments are going to be reliable way more often than your bodily systems are, especially when you're down your visual system, right? When you're down not your specific visual system, but the ability for your visual system to detect things going on in its surroundings. So trust your instruments. Always trust your instruments. When in doubt, what do? Trust our instruments. Motion sickness is also something, especially as a commercial pilot, when you're going to have to start thinking about passengers. That is something that is very, very, very important to the comfort and the safety of your passengers, because understanding motion sickness and how to combat it will allow us to be better equipped for situations where either we are, or even more so, when our passengers are experiencing motion sickness. And what motion sickness really is, like if you've ever been in a boat, you'll feel discomfort, nausea, you'll feel like you want to vomit, sweating, people get pale, all sorts of things can be symptoms of motion sickness. But what it really is that your body is used to being on level ground, right? But when you're on a boat and you have a motion of the ocean, or you have waves or all sorts of other things that make the ground that you're standing on not stable, it can send conflicting messages to the brain, which confuses it, and your body responds by reacting with all of these symptoms of discomfort, of general discomfort, and all these things that we don't want to feel. That's why there's motion sickness. And the same can be said in the air when we're flying, right, with turbulence, with chop. with winds coming in different directions, with gusts. All of these things can impact your body and how it receives information, right? All of these things. And so how we can treat that for our passengers, we can open vents, right? Fresh air is always great medication, if you will, or treatment for for people experiencing these discomforts of motion sickness. That's why, like, I have a grandfather who, when we fly together, another way that you can combat motion sickness is by looking outside, looking into the distance. So whenever I fly with my grandpa, he has to have a window seat, or else he will experience his motion sickness, so he can look out of his window and focus on something in the distance, right? And avoiding unnecessary movements, right? You want to stay as stable as possible in motion sickness situations. And usually for people who have motion sickness, it usually, when your body becomes more and more accustomed to it, when you get your sea legs underneath you, or your sky legs, if that's what you like to call them, in aviation specifically, that is something that for students and for people who are new to aviation can overcome within a couple of lessons if they do experience motion sickness. Something that is typically used to combat motion sickness is Dramamine. But Dramamine is something that we generally, or definitely as a pilot, cannot use. On those lists, and the list of medications that that pilots can use in the FAA, or the pilots can't fly with, Dramamine is one of them. We cannot take Dramamine as a pilot. They can be used for passengers if they're feeling bad, but for pilots specifically, for someone manipulating the flight controls, you cannot operate with Dramamine in your system, right? Carbon monoxide poisoning is also something, especially in general aviation, that we're going to see and we're going to have experience with, right? Especially as as temperatures get cold and you get into the fall months when stuff starts to get cold, we start to use heating systems in our aircraft. There can be a leak in those heating systems from the engine that produces carbon monoxide, right? In the engine, the exhaust will produce carbon monoxide. And if that leaks into the cabin, that can cause you to have hypoxia, right? And I believe hypoxia, where your blood is not able to react with or to interact with oxygen and distributing it through your system, right? So carbon monoxide is actually, it's absorbed, I think, about 200 times easier than oxygen is in your blood, right? So if your blood is interacting 200 times more with carbon monoxide than it is oxygen, then that carbon monoxide is going to take the place of the oxygen being distributed into your body, which, right, can cause all sorts of things that we don't want to have. Effects of headaches, blurred vision, dizziness, drowning, loss of muscle power, right? Your reaction time, just like in hypoxia, which this effectively contributes to hypoxia, right? In this contribution to hypoxia, we won't be able to react properly, right? So whenever we do experience carbon monoxide, we want to get on the ground, or carbon monoxide poisoning, we want to get on the ground as quickly as possible, because we should not be flying with the threat or the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is why in general aviation, in the aircraft that I got my private in, the little steam gauge 172, they'll have these cards in the cockpit, and when the card becomes discolored, because carbon monoxide is an odorless and tasteless gas, so we can't like smell like, oh, it's carbon monoxide. So we're going to have indications that tell us, okay, hey, we have a threat of carbon monoxide poisoning here. So in this little card, it will be discolored, and it will change colors and indicate that, hey, there is a carbon monoxide link or leak into our cockpit. So that is how we can indicate it. And again, it doesn't allow our body to transport oxygen through our blood in our body as necessary. to operate. So carbon monoxide can even, if extreme enough, even not in an aircraft, it can kill you, right? Having that inability for oxygen to be transported throughout your body to extreme cases can kill you. So carbon monoxide poisoning is definitely something that we do not want to interact with in aviation. So much to the point where it takes 48 hours, if you do experience carbon monoxide poisoning, for that carbon monoxide to leave your system, to fully get through your system. So if you do experience carbon monoxide poisoning, a general rule of thumb is do not operate an aircraft for the preceding or the next 48 hours. And fatigue and stress, right? Those are some things that are very, very important. But with fatigue and stress, this also gets to our point of the I am safe checklist, right? So the I am safe checklist, and in my teaching, if this was a private applicant, I would not necessarily expect them to know this. A commercial applicant, I would hope that they do, but if they didn't, that'd be okay. So at Purdue, specifically, we have all sorts of checklists. We have the flight risk assessment tool, right? The FRAT, that allows us to kind of it allows us a system to objectively see, okay, should I fly? But I believe, though, that the FRAT, the flight risk assessment tool that we have at Purdue, can kind of take the learning experience of go and no-go decisions out of a student's hand. So I believe personally that going through each of these points and understanding how it affects us and understanding how I can interact with it allows you to be a better pilot personally. If you can understand your own systems and your own personal self, then that will, because there can be all sorts of problems with a system that takes the decision making out of your hands. So even if there's a situation where you get a green light on a frat, if you go through these things and you say, okay, like I might be a little ill, but I can work through it, right? You can either have one of these things, oh, I'm taking a medication I shouldn't fly with, or oh, I'm emotionally or feelings, right? I am not in a place where I should be operating an aircraft, right? So I believe that for a student to understand their own self and their personal minimums, but also being able to walk through these things, either it can be one thing that keeps us, from flying, right? Or it can be death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's like, oh, I'm a little sick. Oh, this medication I can fly with, but it's not great. Or all these things, right? Or alcohol, I'm below the blood alcohol content level, or whatever. You can have all, like, little bits of each of these things can add up to an inability for personal minimums and to fly, right? So for the first one, going through them all, we have illness, right? So if you have a cough or a cold, that might not be something that instigates an inability to fly, but if you have COVID, that's a great example, or if you have a bad flu or a throbbing headache, right? Based on what we talked about earlier, even with pressure problems with certain illnesses, it might be an indication that, hey, maybe I shouldn't fly today, right? Or medications, that's another one. Now, a hard and fast rule with medications is obviously, if you have a medication in your system that the FAA says you cannot fly with, then you should not fly, right? Or even if you have ibuprofen or Advil or something like that that you're flying with, that for you personally interacts with you in such a way that is not healthy for you to fly, or you do not feel safe flying, or you do not feel to your fullest ability, then you shouldn't fly, right? Like, these are all personal things that you can go through, right? The next one, stress, right? And this is a big one at Purdue. At Purdue, we are a very academically rigorous university, right? And we take pride in that, but that can also put a certain amount of stress on students, right? So if you have a huge exam the next day that you're really struggling with, and maybe you're struggling in a class, in order to do well, you need to get a certain grade to pass the class. Maybe that would insinuate enough stress where you wouldn't feel comfortable flying, right? Or in another situation, maybe you have a family member that has died, or you have financial problems, or all sorts of other things, or maybe whatever it may be. Everyone deals differently with stress. Whatever induces enough stress that makes you uncomfortable to fly, maybe that would be a situation where you shouldn't fly, right? And then we have alcohol. And as we've talked about earlier, alcohol, there are minimums, right? And there are regulations. Okay, blood alcohol content of 0.04, right? Can't fly with, right? Or you have the legal, like from the last time you consumed alcohol, you can't fly for 8 hours, right? Those are regulatory. Those are things that we can't fly with, right? But maybe you interact with alcohol differently. Maybe you have experienced a hangover that for you maybe lasts longer than it does the average person, right? Those are things that you need to take into account, right? Beyond just the legal limits. Like at Purdue, we've actually extended this limit to 12 hours, right? You cannot fly after consuming alcohol for 12 hours. That is not an FAA requirement, but that is a pretty university policy that we have here. So alcohol, that is another big one. Another one is fatigue, right? We have fatigue, right? So we talked about this earlier. If you have not had enough sleep, right? If you've not had enough sleep, or let's say maybe the night before you had, again, with going along with the stress, these can go hand in hand, right? You had a big exam you stayed and you pulled an all-nighter studying for, right? And you the next day you just are sluggish, you're tired. Those can be indications of why I shouldn't be able to fly, maybe in some cases, right? And again, like if there's multiple of these that kind of come together, maybe like the fatigue alone, I'd still be comfortable flying. The stress alone, I'd still be comfortable flying, right? And the illness alone, I'd still be comfortable flying. But all of these things adding up together might insinuate a circumstance where you don't fly, right? You're not comfortable flying. And the last one is emotions, right? As human beings, we all experience emotions, right? There's no shame in experiencing emotion, right? Sometimes you go through, it goes along with stress, right? Sometimes it's our body's a response to stress, right? It's maybe you have a death in the family, or you've had a breakup or something along those lines where you're emotionally not capable of dealing with the stresses and the tension that can kind of rear their head as we fly, right? And with all these things, with stress specifically, you can have either acute or chronic stress. So acute is more of the fight or flight response of the body to certain situations in flight. Maybe like, we're going on a stall. It's the first thing we've ever done, a stall, right? So you react and you have this acute short-term stress, right? Or maybe there are situations where I, as an instructor, would never want to do this, but you have stress every time you fly with an instructor. That's acute stress, right? Like when you're flying, it's short-term stress, but that builds up over time where you don't want to fly anymore because you're so stressed out every time you enter that situation. That is more of a chronic stress, right? So understanding the differences between those, acute is like more fight or flight. It's short-term. Chronic is something that's a bigger picture or acute stress that's just compiled over time. And understanding what kind of stress you're experiencing can allow you to react appropriately, right? That is really all that I have. We've already talked about drugs and alcohol and medications. One other thing that I think is very, very important to touch on is scuba diving, right? In scuba diving, right, when we talked about earlier with the pressures of being sick and climbing altitude, so right, when we go to altitude, right, the pressure differential of there's less pressure at altitude than there is on the ground, your body has to adjust to, right? And the same can be said about scuba diving. When you go down in altitude effectively, and you go below sea level in all cases I can think of. When you're scuba diving, you have excess pressure that your body also has to adjust to. And even scuba divers, there are instances where they have to, when they're down so deep, they have to come up back to the surface in increments, right? Because if you come back up all at once, your body adjusts too quickly and you have nitrogen bubbles come into your brain that can kill you or cause all sorts of health problems, right? So the same can be said about when you're scuba diving. You still take all the proper precautions. You get back up to sea level. You get out of the water. You're fine. Your body is still adjusting to getting back to sea level. So the last thing you want to do is fly. So if you've recently scuba dived, either one, you should not fly for the following day or so. Right, you need to be very, very careful with scuba diving and going back to flying. And you can talk to an AME about that for more details. You can talk to maybe scuba instructors that know. But that is something that you should be aware of, is going straight from scuba diving to flying. That can cause all sorts of pressure differentials within your body. That can cause all sorts of health implications. With that, that is all that I have for Aeromedical Factors. At this point in the presentation, I would open up the floor to my student for any questions pertaining to different factors and how they interact with each other, or how we can mitigate problems, or specific scenarios in their own personal lives or flying experience where they've experienced different levels of hypoxia or other aeromedical factors. So thank you so much for your time.